The air in the small, enclosed room was heavy, smelling of sweat, incense, and the terrifying electricity that precedes violence. It was a moment that shouldn't have existed, a collision of two worlds that had been drifting apart for centuries, finally crashing together in a single, explosive singularity. On one side stood a man who carried the weight of 1,500 years of history, a disciple of the Shaolin legacy who believed that form, ritual, and lineage were the only things separating martial arts from barbarism. On the other side stood Bruce Lee, a man who had stripped away the robes, the bowing, and the mysticism to reveal the cold, hard truth of combat. The challenger looked at Lee with eyes that were not angry, but disappointed, and delivered the sentence that would ignite the fuse. "You forgot tradition." He believed he was there to teach a lesson to an arrogant upstart. He didn't know that he was standing across from a man who had already deconstructed the physics of human movement. He didn't know that the lesson would be his, and it would take exactly 14 seconds to learn. To understand the magnitude of this 14-second encounter, you have to understand the volatile atmosphere of the martial arts world in the mid-1960s. At that time, Kung Fu was a secret society, a closed loop of knowledge passed down from master to student behind locked doors in Chinatown basements. It was governed by strict hierarchies and an almost religious adherence to forms, which were choreographed sequences of movement that were supposed to simulate combat. To the traditionalists, these forms were sacred. They were the preserved wisdom of the ancestors. To Bruce Lee, they were what he called the classical mess. Lee was openly teaching these secrets to everyone regardless of race or background. If you had the will to learn, he would teach you. This was blasphemy to the establishment, but worse than who he taught was what he taught. He was telling the world that the traditional horse stance was immobile and useless, that the rigid blocks were too slow, and that the flamboyant kicks were suicide in a real fight. He was dismantling the very altar the traditionalists worshipped at, and they could not let it stand. The challenge did not come with fanfare or a referee. It came with a knock on the door and a scroll of rules that Lee immediately crumpled up. The challenger, often described in oral histories as a representative of the strict northern Shaolin lineage, was not a brawler, he was a technician. He moved with the fluid grace of a man who had performed the sets 10,000 times. He was the embodiment of tradition. When he stepped onto the mat, he assumed a classic posture, a stance that had been depicted in scrolls and statues for dynasties. It was beautiful, it was stable, it was a fortress of structure. He told Lee that by abandoning these stances, he had abandoned the soul of the art. He expected Lee to respond with a counterstance, to engage in the turn-based exchange of techniques that defined sparring in the traditional schools. He was waiting for a duel of styles. What he got was a street fight. Bruce Lee did not sink into a deep horse stance. He didn't raise his hands in a complex guard. He stood with his knees slightly bent, his heels floating off the ground, bouncing with a rhythm that was alien to the Shaolin paradigm. This was the on-guard position, a stance stripped of all ornamentation, designed for one thing only, which was explosive forward momentum. When the fight began, the timer in the room started ticking. The monk launched an attack, a sweeping, circular motion intended to bridge the gap and test Lee's defense. It was a move that worked perfectly in the dojo, where partners cooperated with the rhythm, but Lee wasn't cooperating. He intercepted. This is the moment where physics overtook philosophy. In the first 3 seconds, Lee demonstrated the concept of the stop hit. Instead of blocking the monk's strike and then countering, which is a 1-2 rhythm that takes time, Lee struck into the attack. He fired a lead straight punch that traveled a shorter distance than the monk's swinging arm. It was simple geometry. The straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. Lee's fist arrived before the monk's attack could generate full power. The impact shattered the monk's rhythm instantly. The tradition of block then strike was obsolete before the first breath was exhaled. By the 5th second, the monk was backpedaling. The beautiful low stances that looked so imposing in demonstration became a liability. To move backward in a deep stance requires a shifting of weight that is slow and laborious. Lee, moving on the balls of his feet like a fencer, simply overran him. He unleashed a chain-punching combination that was a staple of Wing Chun, but modified with the hip rotation of Western boxing. This was the modernity Lee was preaching. He wasn't inventing new moves, he was optimizing biomechanics. He saw the human body not as a vessel for tradition, but as a machine for generating kinetic energy. The monk was trying to fight a ghost of the past, while Lee was fighting the reality of the present. The 10-second mark, the psychological break occurred. You could see it in the eyes of the challenger. He realized that the forms he had practiced for decades, the patterns he believed made him invincible, were utterly useless against a man who refused to play by the rules. Lee was cutting angles, stepping on his toes, trapping his hands, and overwhelming his sensory processing. The tradition the monk spoke of was based on the assumption that the opponent would fight like a gentleman. Lee fought like a nightmare. He closed the distance with a blinding burst of speed, trapping the monk's lead arm and firing a back fist that snapped like a whip. There was no mysticism here, no Kai projection, no secret death touch. It was speed, timing, and relentless pressure. At 14 seconds, it was over. The challenger was not dead, but his worldview was. He was pinned or driven back to a point of no return, unable to launch a single effective offense. The fight didn't end with a dramatic knockout from a movie. It ended with the crushing realization of obsolescence. Lee stopped. He didn't need to continue. The point had been proven not just to the man in the room, but to history. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. The claim that Lee had forgotten tradition hung in the air, now sounding absurd. Lee hadn't forgotten it. He had evolved past it. He looked at the winded challenger and, according to the lore of those present, offered a perspective that would become the bedrock of Jeet Kune Do. Tradition is a statue. Evolution is a river. You cannot fight the current with a stone. This 14-second dismantling sent shockwaves through the martial arts community that are still felt today. It was the catalyst for a total paradigm shift. Before this, martial arts were categorized by style, such as karate versus judo or kung fu versus boxing. After this, the question changed from what is your style to simply what works. Lee's victory proved that a fighter cannot be bound by a fixed set of patterns. If you memorize a solution, you will be defeated by a problem you haven't seen before. The monk had memorized answers to specific questions, but Lee was changing the questions in real time. This concept of aliveness, training against a resisting opponent who is trying to hit you, became the gold standard for combat sports. Critics and historians often debate the specifics of Lee's challenge matches. Some say they lasted minutes, others say seconds, but the duration is almost irrelevant compared to the result. The brevity of this specific encounter serves as the perfect metaphor for the efficiency Lee preached. If a fight lasts longer than a few seconds, Lee argued, you are doing something wrong. You are playing, not finishing. The fact that a high-level traditionalist could be neutralized so quickly was terrifying to the establishment because it threatened their livelihood. If forms didn't work, why pay for lessons? If the secrets were useless, why bow to the master? Lee was exposing a fragility in the system that no one wanted to admit existed. However, it is important to realize that Lee did not hate tradition. He studied it voraciously. He possessed a library of thousands of books on every style of combat imaginable, from fencing to wrestling to classical gung fu. The 14 seconds wasn't a rejection of the past, it was a filtration process. He kept what was useful, such as the centerline theory of Wing Chun and the kicks of northern styles, and discarded what was useless, such as the rigid stances, the chambered hands, and the telegraphing motions. The challenger who told him he forgot tradition failed to see that Lee was actually saving it. He was saving the martial essence from the decay of empty ritual. He was returning combat to its primal roots of survival and efficiency. In the aftermath of that brief, violent exchange, Bruce Lee didn't celebrate. He reportedly felt that 14 seconds was still too long. He was winded not from the physical exertion but from the inefficient release of nervous energy. This obsession with perfection drove him to reinvent his own training. He began running miles every day, lifting heavy iron and sparring with full contact gear, methods that were unheard of in traditional Chinese martial arts circles at the time. The challenger unknowingly had given Lee the greatest gift possible, which was dissatisfaction. That dissatisfaction birthed Jeet Kune Do. It birthed the modern era of mixed martial arts. Every time you see a UFC fighter combine Muay Thai knees with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu grappling and Western boxing footwork, you are seeing the echoes of that 14-second fight. The legacy of that encounter is not that the Shaolin monk was weak or that tradition is bad. The lesson is that effectiveness is the only truth in combat. The monk walked in with a map of the territory, but Bruce Lee walked in knowing the terrain. Maps get outdated. They don't show the storms, the fallen trees, or the shifting mud. Tradition is a map drawn by men who died centuries ago. Instinct honed by scientific training is the ability to navigate the terrain as it is right now. 14 seconds was all it took to tear up the map. Bruce Lee didn't win because he was faster or stronger, though he was both. He won because he was present. He wasn't fighting for the honor of the ancestors. He was fighting for the reality of the moment. And in the brutal honesty of a fight, reality always wins.